The disappearance of the young girl left the whole town in shock. For days, there was no word on where she had gone or what had happened to her. Her family, frantic with worry, reached out to anyone who might help, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. The local police launched an investigation, but with little evidence, they were at a loss. Then, one evening, a tip came in that would turn the case upside down. A witness claimed to have seen a black man in the area near the time the girl went missing. The news spread quickly, and the police, desperate for answers, decided to act on the information. The man they arrested was a father of two, someone who lived in the same neighborhood. He was well known to some, but had no criminal record. It seemed impossible that he could be involved in something so sinister. Still, the police had their lead, and that was enough to make an arrest. The man was taken into custody, and the town buzzed with shock. People began to question his past, trying to find connections, no matter how small. Some people believed he was innocent, but there was a growing tension as others started to believe the worst. The media quickly picked up the story, and soon the man was painted as the villain in the eyes of the public. It seemed as though everyone had already made up their minds before any real investigation could take place. The girl's family, devastated by her disappearance, was naturally relieved when the police made an arrest. They clung to the hope that the man was responsible for what had happened to their daughter. The community rallied around them, offering support in their time of need, and the accusations against the man were taken as truth by many. The emotional weight of the situation was hard to bear for everyone involved, and the pressure for justice mounted with each passing day. But the man, sitting in jail, couldn't understand how his life had suddenly been turned upside down. He knew he had done nothing wrong. His family, who had been supporting him from the beginning, struggled to comprehend how something so unjust could happen to someone they loved. They knew him as a hard-working, kind-hearted person who would never hurt anyone, let alone a child. But despite their beliefs in his innocence, the accusations continued to pile up. And it seemed like the truth didn't matter to the people who had already formed their opinions. As the days wore on, the investigation began to lose momentum. With few leads to follow, the authorities focused all their energy on the man they had arrested. Meanwhile, the girl's family, though relieved by the arrest, began to wonder if they were overlooking something. They had always known their daughter to be a free spirit, and it wasn't like her to just disappear without telling anyone. Still, they clung to the idea that the man was the one responsible, unable to believe that the truth might be something entirely different. As the investigation continued, the pressure to find the girl grew stronger. The community was in turmoil, divided between those who believed the man was guilty and those who held on to the hope that he was innocent. The police, now fully invested in their lead, focused their efforts on finding more evidence that would tie the man to the crime. But the deeper they dug, the more questions arose. The man maintained his innocence, insisting that he had no involvement in the girl's disappearance. But the authorities were determined, and their focus never wavered. The man's attorney, however, wasn't convinced by the case against him. He believed there was something more to the story and began looking into every detail. His team combed through the evidence, trying to find inconsistencies that might help prove his client's innocence. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that the case was based on shaky assumptions and half-truths. Despite this, the media continued to report on the man's arrest with sensational headlines, feeding the public's thirst for answers. One of the most troubling aspects of the investigation was the lack of solid evidence linking the man to the crime. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, and no physical evidence to suggest he had even been near the girl. Yet the police pressed on, convinced that they were on the right track. They focused on the witness who had seen the man near the scene and built their entire case around that one account. Meanwhile, the girl's parents were dealing with their own conflicting emotions. While they were desperate to find their daughter, they couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of relief that someone had been arrested. It gave them a sense of closure, even though they didn't fully understand how it had happened. They didn't know the details of the investigation, but the arrest gave them a glimmer of hope that their daughter would be found soon. As the investigation dragged on, the pressure from the public continued to mount. The town's residents, once calm and trusting, now found themselves divided. Some people began to voice their doubts, questioning how quickly the police had arrested the man without enough proof. Others, however, still believed the worst. The whispers grew louder and rumors spread about the man's past. no matter how irrelevant they were to the current situation. The girl's disappearance had become a cause for many, and with the arrest, people felt that justice was within reach. But the longer the case dragged on without concrete answers, the more frustrated the community became. They demanded the truth, but the more they pushed for answers, the more the investigation seemed to spiral. In the midst of all this, the girl's family struggled with the fact that their daughter's disappearance might not be as simple as they had imagined. They had spent so much time searching for the answers they wanted to hear. But now doubts began to creep in. The authorities seemed too focused on the man, and it was hard to ignore the feeling that something was being missed. The man's family stood by him, refusing to believe the accusations. They knew the person they loved, the father and husband who had always been there for them. His arrest had changed their lives, but they held on to the hope that the truth would come out eventually. They were determined not to let the false accusations break their family apart. But as the investigation continued, there was still no sign of the girl. The authorities couldn't find any new leads, and the case seemed to stall. Despite the lack of evidence, the police insisted that they were close to solving the mystery. It became clear that the man was at the center of their focus, and they were willing to go to great lengths to find a connection between him and the girl's disappearance. After days of mounting frustration, a surprising breakthrough came when an old piece of overlooked evidence resurfaced. It was a grainy security camera footage from a nearby store, one that had been recorded the same day the girl went missing. The footage had been sitting in a pile of unexamined material, but when one of the investigators decided to give it a closer look, it revealed something unexpected. In the footage, the girl was seen walking down the street not alone but with a friend. The two girls were chatting and laughing, completely unaware of the growing fear that surrounded their disappearance. The footage was a turning point. It didn't show the man at all, which meant that the original witness's account, which had been the cornerstone of the police's case, was inaccurate. As the investigation team reviewed the footage again, they discovered even more revealing details. The girls had entered a nearby park, where they had spent hours before leaving in different directions. The girl who had gone missing had simply walked away, deciding to stay with a friend instead of returning home. It was a moment of childish rebellion, one that had led to a series of misunderstandings. With this new evidence, the police had to reevaluate their entire approach. They quickly realized that the man they had arrested had nothing to do with the disappearance at all. The arrest had been based on assumptions and the convenience of a single, shaky eyewitness account. It was clear that the girl had not been kidnapped, but had in fact run away. The man's name had been dragged through the mud, and now there was a real risk that he would never be able to shake off the public's perception of him as a criminal. While the community had initially rallied around the girl's family, offering them support in their search for the truth, the new evidence caused many to question everything they had been told. People started to wonder how such a huge mistake could have been made, and whether they had been too quick to judge. Some were embarrassed by their own part in spreading the accusations, while others were angry at the police for rushing to conclusions without properly verifying the facts. The man's family, on the other hand, was stunned, but they couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. For days they had lived in a state of shock and disbelief, wondering how they could support him in a situation that seemed so hopeless. Now, with the truth coming to light, they felt a sense of relief, knowing that he would soon be released. However, they also understood that the damage to his reputation had already been done. Even once he was exonerated, there would still be people who remembered the accusations, who would look at him with suspicion and doubt. The girl's family, too, had their own emotions to deal with. While they were relieved to know that their daughter was safe and unharmed, they couldn't escape the guilt of what had transpired. The girl had run away from home, but the police had made it seem like a kidnapping, and that mistake had led to the man's arrest. Her parents struggled to reconcile their feelings, relief that their daughter was okay, but also shame for the false accusations that had been made. The girl, once she returned home, felt a deep sense of guilt for what had happened. She had never imagined that her decision to stay with a friend would spiral into something so much bigger. She had wanted to escape the pressure of home life, but now she saw the consequences of her actions. Her parents had been frantic, and the man who had been wrongfully accused had spent days in jail. She knew that the damage to everyone involved couldn't easily be undone. As the days passed, the community began to process the reality of the situation. There was a growing sense of disbelief over how everything had unfolded. The police had acted swiftly but without sufficient evidence, and the public had jumped to conclusions far too quickly. The man who had been wrongly accused was the subject of many whispers, with some still questioning his innocence, even after the truth had come to light. Others, however, felt a deep regret for their part in the rush to judgment. For the man, the reality of being cleared was bittersweet. He had been freed, yes, but the toll it had taken on his life was undeniable. His family struggled with the fact that their loved one had been through something so unjust. His children, once proud of their father, now faced the stares and whispers of classmates who didn't fully understand the situation. It wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about the long-term damage to his personal and professional life. But amidst all the hurt and confusion, there was one undeniable fact. The truth had finally come out. The girl wasn't kidnapped and the man had done nothing wrong. There was no longer any doubt about his innocence. Now the focus was on how to rebuild and heal the wounds left behind by the wrongful accusations. The release of the man from jail was a moment that should have been a cause for celebration, but instead it was marked by a sense of uneasy relief. Though the truth had finally come out, the damage to his life couldn't be so easily erased. The town that had once been filled with support for his family now seemed to carry an air of judgment. The accusations against him had spread far and wide, and despite his release, there were still whispers behind closed doors. His children, who had once looked up to him as their hero, now faced taunts and teasing from their classmates. Some of the other children called them names or made cruel jokes about their father. It wasn't just the children either. Even adults who had once been friends and neighbors now seemed unsure of what to believe. Though the truth had been revealed, the public perception of the man had already been tainted. His reputation, once solid, was now in ruins. The man's family tried their best to support him through it all, but even they couldn't escape the weight of the situation. His wife, who had stood by him through the darkest moments, began to feel the strain. Their relationship, though strong, was tested as the town turned its back on them. Friends who had once been close seemed to avoid them, unwilling to face the reality of their mistake. The community that had once embraced them now felt distant and cold. As for the man himself, he struggled with the emotional fallout. He had been through so much, yet it was difficult to find peace. He had been wrongfully accused, and while the truth had come out, the pain and frustration of being falsely imprisoned remained with him. He found it hard to shake the feeling that the accusations would follow him for the rest of his life. He had lost his job while in custody, and even after his release he found it difficult to find another one. The cloud of suspicion still hung over him. The girl's family, too, was going through their own struggle. While they were glad to have their daughter back, they couldn't help but feel immense guilt for their part in the mess. They had never intended for anyone to get hurt, but in their fear and worry they had made a terrible mistake. They had convinced themselves that the man was responsible, without questioning the evidence or considering the possibility that their daughter was simply trying to avoid going home. The girl, now back with her family, was weighed down by guilt. She had never thought her decision to stay with a friend would lead to such chaos. She had wanted to escape the stress at home, but now she saw that her actions had hurt everyone around her. She had caused the man's life to be turned upside down, and for that, she felt deeply sorry. She wanted to make things right, but she wasn't sure how. In the weeks that followed, the girl's family tried to make amends. They reached out to the man, offering an apology. It was a small gesture, but they hoped it would help begin the healing process. The man, though understandably hurt and angry, accepted the apology, though it did little to heal the wounds that had been caused. He understood that the girl's family had acted out of fear and desperation, but the damage to his life could never be fully undone. The police, too, faced their own reckoning. While the evidence had cleared the man's name, the community began to question the way the investigation had been handled. Many people wondered how such a huge mistake could have been made, and why the police had rushed to judgment without properly investigating all the facts. The department issued a public apology, but it was clear that trust had been broken and regaining it would take time. The girls' school became a place where the consequences of the situation played out. Students who had been supportive of her when she first went missing now seemed unsure of how to interact with her. Some were even angry, feeling that she had put everyone through unnecessary pain. The teachers, too, were unsure of how to address the issue, knowing that their students had been affected by the fallout. As the man and his family tried to rebuild their lives, the girl's family found themselves grappling with the fallout of their own actions. They had been so caught up in the fear of losing their daughter that they hadn't thought about the bigger picture. They hadn't considered the impact their assumptions would have on someone else's life. Now they were left to deal with the consequences, knowing that the trust between them and the man could never be fully restored. The community, too, was left to face its own mistakes. The quickness with which everyone had rushed to judgment was a stark reminder of how easily fear and prejudice could take hold. The police had acted on a single piece of unreliable information, and the public had been too eager to believe it without questioning the facts. In the end, the truth had come out, but it had cost a lot more than anyone had expected.